My son-in-law looked me dead in the eye and said, "We needed the garage. Your tools are in the side yard." I'd been home from the hospital for less than 20 minutes. My knee was wrapped in a brace. I was still carrying the discharge papers in my hand, and the man living in my house rent-free for 3 years had converted my woodworking shop into a bedroom for his brother without asking me a single word. I set the papers down on the kitchen counter very slowly. Then I looked at my daughter. She looked away first. That was the moment I knew exactly what I was going to do. My name is Gerald, and I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a structural engineer for a firm outside of Columbus, Ohio. I retired early, not because I had to, but because I'd planned carefully, saved aggressively, and promised myself I would spend my 60s doing the things I'd put off during the years I spent behind a desk. Woodworking, travel, long mornings with a cup of coffee, and no alarm clock. I'd earned that, and I knew it. My wife, Patricia, passed away 6 years ago. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed in March, gone by October, 7 months. I won't spend much time on that because even now it sits in my chest like a stone I can't dislodge. What I will say is that losing her changed the geography of the house. Every room felt different. The kitchen, the back porch, the bedroom, all of it carried her absence like a second presence. For a long time I didn't know what to do with the silence. My daughter Melissa was 28 when her mother died. She'd been living in an apartment in Cincinnati with her boyfriend at the time, a man named Troy. They'd been together about 2 years. I'd met Troy maybe 4 or 5 times before the funeral. He was the kind of man who talked a lot without saying much, always had an explanation for everything, always had a reason why something wasn't his fault. I noticed it but said nothing. He was Melissa's choice, and Melissa was a grown woman. They got married the following spring. Small ceremony, backyard of Troy's mother's house in Dayton. I walked Melissa down the aisle between 2 rose bushes and tried to feel only happiness for her. Mostly I succeeded. About 8 months after the wedding, Melissa called me on a Sunday evening. Troy had been laid off from his job at a logistics company, something about restructuring, she said. They were having trouble covering rent. She asked if they could stay with me for a few months, just until Troy found something new. I want to be honest about this part. I hesitated. Something in me, the part that had watched Troy operate for 2 years, pressed pause. But then I thought about Melissa. I thought about her mother. I thought about that empty house and the stone in my chest, and I said yes. They moved in on a Friday in November. 2 carloads of belongings, a dog named Bucket, and what I would later understand was absolutely no intention of leaving. The first year was tolerable. Troy did find work, not at the level he'd had before, but he was employed. Melissa was working as a dental office manager, making decent money. I didn't charge them rent, which I now understand was my first serious mistake. I told myself I was helping family through a rough patch. What I was actually doing was removing every incentive they had to leave. By year 2, the rough patch had quietly become a permanent arrangement. No one said so out loud. There was no conversation where Melissa sat across from me and said, "Dad, we're staying indefinitely." It happened through accumulation. A piece of furniture they bought that was too large for a temporary stay, a garden Melissa planted in the backyard as though she owned it, a section of the coat closet that gradually expanded until my jackets were crammed into one corner. Troy's contributions to the household were, to be precise, 0. He paid no rent. He contributed nothing toward utilities, groceries, or maintenance. Melissa bought her own groceries and occasionally cleaned the kitchen, which I appreciated, but Troy moved through the house as though it were a hotel he'd received a comp upgrade at. He watched television on my couch, ate my food when it was available, and used my garage, which I had converted into a proper woodworking shop over many years, with a workbench, a table saw, a lathe, and storage for every tool I owned, as a place to park his truck during winter, so it wouldn't need to be scraped in the morning. I said something about that. I told him the garage was my workshop and I needed access to it year-round. He said, "Sure, absolutely, no problem." The truck remained in the garage. I should have acted then. I know that now. But I told myself it was a small thing, that pressing the issue would create tension, that it wasn't worth the damage to my relationship with Melissa. I was wrong on all 3 counts. What I was actually doing was teaching Troy that the word no, coming from me, had no real consequences. My knee problems started 2 years into their stay. I'd had cartilage damage in my left knee since my 40s, an old injury from a hiking trip that I'd managed with exercise and stubbornness, but it worsened significantly in my early 60s. By last spring, I was in enough pain that my orthopedic surgeon told me we were out of options, short of a total knee replacement. I scheduled the surgery for September. I told Melissa and Troy well in advance. I explained that the recovery would take 6 to 8 weeks, that I would be limited in my mobility for the first several days, and that I would need the house to be orderly and accessible when I came home. Melissa nodded. Troy said, "Yeah, for sure." I believed them because I wanted to believe them. My neighbor, a retired school teacher named Francis, who has lived next door for 22 years, offered to drive me to and from the hospital. I was grateful for that. My friend Carl, who I'd worked with for the better part of 2 decades, called the morning of the surgery and talked to me for 40 minutes about nothing in particular, just to keep me company. Good people, both of them. The surgery itself went fine. I was in the hospital for 2 nights. The orthopedic team got me walking with a walker on the second day, told me I was progressing well, and cleared me for discharge on a Thursday morning. Frances picked me up at 10:30. We stopped at the pharmacy for my prescriptions, and then she drove me home. I want to tell you what I found when I got there. The first thing I noticed was the driveway. There were 2 vehicles parked in it that I didn't recognize: a dark green pickup truck and a small silver sedan. Frances pulled in behind them and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You have company?" she asked. I told her I didn't know. I came through the front door using the walker, and the house immediately felt different. There was more furniture than I'd left: a recliner in the corner of the living room that wasn't mine, shoes by the door that weren't Melissa's or Troy's, a duffel bag in the hallway. There was music coming from somewhere in the back of the house. Melissa came out of the kitchen. She was wearing an expression I had never seen on her face before, something between guilt and preemptive defensiveness, like a person who knows the conversation they're about to have and has already decided how to survive it. "Dad," she said, "you're home." "I am," I said. "Whose vehicles are those in the driveway?" She opened her mouth. Before she could answer, Troy came around the corner from the hallway, and behind him was a man I'd never seen, late 30s, heavy-set, wearing a flannel shirt, carrying a cardboard box. Behind him was a woman who I would later learn was Troy's mother, Barbara. She was somewhere in her mid-60s, wearing a housecoat, and she looked at me with the flat expression of someone who had been told this conversation was going to happen, and had decided it was not her problem. Troy said, "Hey, Gerald. Good, you're back. So we've got some family staying for a bit." I looked at him. "Who?" "My brother, Kevin, and my mom." He said it the way you might tell someone you'd rearranged the furniture. A minor logistical update, nothing requiring permission. "Kevin's going through some stuff, and Mom didn't want to be alone, so—" "Where are they sleeping?" I said. There was a pause. "We set up the garage," Troy said. I didn't say anything for a moment. I looked down the hallway toward the back of the house, toward the door that led to my garage, my workbench, my table saw, the lathe I'd spent 14 months restoring, the shelves of tools I'd collected over 30 years. "You set up the garage," I said. "Yeah. We put up some drywall on one side, got a space heater. It's actually pretty comfortable. Kevin's been fixing it up." "And my tools?" Troy gestured vaguely toward the back door. "We moved them outside. There's a tarp." I stood there in my own house, 48 hours out of knee replacement surgery, leaning on a walker, and I understood with absolute clarity what had happened. It wasn't an emergency. It wasn't a crisis that had forced their hand while I was incapacitated in a hospital bed. It was a decision made deliberately, while I was unable to come home and object, to expand their occupation of my property, to include my garage, and to install 2 additional people in my house without asking my permission. I looked at Melissa. She looked at the floor. I said, "I need to sit down." Frances helped me to the couch. She gave me a look that said everything she was too polite to say out loud. I told her I was fine, thanked her, and asked her to leave so I could speak with my family. She squeezed my hand on the way out. Once the door closed, I looked at Melissa and I said, "Sit down." She sat. Troy remained standing, which told me something about where he thought the power in the room was. Kevin had disappeared. Barbara had moved to the kitchen, and I could hear her opening cabinet doors. I took a breath and I said, I want to understand exactly what you thought was going to happen when I came home. Melissa said, Dad, Kevin is in a really bad spot. He lost his apartment. And Barbara, Troy's mom, she shouldn't be alone. She has some health problems. I didn't ask why, I said. I asked what you thought was going to happen. Did you believe I would walk through the door and simply accept that two strangers had moved into my house and that my workshop had been torn apart? Troy said, It's not strangers. It's my family. It's my house, I said. He did the thing I'd seen him do before, the slight smile, the dismissive tilt of his head. I mean, yeah, technically, but not technically, I said. Completely. In every legal and practical sense, this is my house. I own it. I pay the property taxes on it. I've lived here for 27 years. You have been a guest here, without paying rent, for 3 years. At no point did that arrangement give you any authority over what happens in this house or who lives in it. We were trying to help. You were not trying to help me, I said. You made a decision that benefited you and your family, and you made it while I was in a hospital bed because you calculated correctly that I couldn't come home and stop you. The room was quiet. Melissa said, quietly, Dad, we didn't know where else to put them. I looked at my daughter, who I had raised and loved, and walked down a makeshift aisle between two rose bushes, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Not rage, not grief. Clarity. Clean and cold, and very still. I want you to hear what I'm about to say very carefully, I said. All of you. Everyone in this house who is not me needs to begin making arrangements to leave. That includes Kevin, Barbara, and the two of you. I am giving you 30 days. Troy laughed. It was a short, incredulous sound. You can't just... I can, I said. And I am. Melissa said, Dad, I love you, I said to her. That hasn't changed. But what you allowed to happen in this house, what you participated in, is not something I'm going to absorb and move past. You made a choice. I'm making mine. I didn't raise my voice once during that conversation. I want to be clear about that. I was 63 years old, and I had just had my left knee replaced, and I was sitting on my own couch talking to people who had treated my home like an asset they could expand into, and I did not raise my voice once. That night, after Melissa and Troy had retreated to their room and the sounds of the house had settled, I lay in my bed and stared at the ceiling. My knee throbbed. I'd missed one of my medication doses in the chaos of coming home, and the pain was sharper than it should have been. I thought about the garage. I thought about the table saw, a cabinet saw. I'd bought at an estate sale in 2009 and spent 3 weekends tuning and aligning perfectly. I thought about my father's hand plane, a vintage Stanley I'd inherited when he died, that I kept in a cloth roll on the second shelf. I thought about whether it was still there, under whatever tarp Troy had thrown over everything, or whether it had been moved, or damaged, or lost. I thought about Melissa standing in the kitchen with that guilty, defensive look on her face. I thought about the 3 years I had spent telling myself she was going through a rough patch and would find her footing. I thought about the rose bushes at her wedding. I didn't sleep well. The next morning I called my attorney, a man named Douglas, who I'd worked with on property matters for years. I explained the situation. He walked me through the process: formal notice of eviction, 30-day timeline, documentation. I told him to start the paperwork. He asked if I was certain. I said yes. Then I called my financial advisor and asked her to review every account where Melissa was listed as a beneficiary. I want to be honest. This was not a decision I made in anger. Anger had already passed, sometime in the night while I was lying in the dark. What remained was something more sober. I had watched my daughter make a series of choices over 3 years, and the accumulation of those choices had produced the scene I'd come home to. I needed to think carefully about what I was leaving behind and to whom. I spent the rest of the morning in the living room, doing my prescribed recovery exercises, watching the back door. At around 10:30, Kevin came through the kitchen on his way to somewhere, saw me, nodded with the particular nonchalance of a man who either didn't understand the situation or had decided not to care about it, and walked out the back door. Barbara came through shortly after. She made herself a cup of coffee using my coffee maker, my coffee, and my mug. Then she sat at my kitchen table and looked at her phone. I said, "Good morning." She said, "Morning," without looking up. I said, "I want to make sure you understand what's happening. You'll need to find another living arrangement within 30 days. She looked up then. Her expression was measured, not surprised. She said, "Troy said you were upset." "I'm not upset," I said. "I'm clear." She looked at me for a moment, then looked back at her phone. Whether she believed me or not, I couldn't tell. I decided it didn't matter. The next few days were the kind of uncomfortable that doesn't resolve through conversation. Melissa made attempts twice. She knocked on my bedroom door in the evenings, and we talked, and both times the conversation reached the same place. She believed that what they'd done was wrong. She was sorry, but she also believed I was overreacting by asking them all to leave. She thought I should have separated Kevin and Barbara from her and Troy. She thought 30 days was punitive. I listened to all of it. I understood her position. But understanding a position isn't the same as accepting it. And what Melissa kept returning to the idea that I should separate my response to the garage situation from my response to 3 years of a pattern told me something important about how she saw the situation. She didn't see the pattern. Or she saw it and had decided it wasn't a pattern, just a series of individual incidents, each one forgivable in isolation. The lock was the thing she kept coming back to. Troy, apparently, had put a padlock on the door between the garage and the interior of the house. His explanation, relayed through Melissa, was that he'd done it for privacy so Kevin and Barbara would have their own space. I had thought about this during those first sleepless nights and arrived at a different interpretation. He had locked my tools and my workshop away from me, in my own house, to prevent me from going in and objecting to what he'd done before he was ready for that conversation. When I said this to Melissa, she said, "That's not why he did it." I said, "Then why did he do it?" She didn't have an answer. My friend Carl came over on day 4. He's 66, retired from engineering the same year I did, still sharp and direct in the way that only old friendship allows. He sat across from me, looked around the house, looked at the closed door down the hallway, and said, "What are you going to do?" I told him what I'd already done, the attorney, the financial review, the 30-day notice. He nodded slowly. He said, "How's Melissa taking it?" I said, "She thinks I'm choosing the garage over my daughter." Carl was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "And what do you think?" I said, "I think I'm choosing myself, for possibly the first time in 3 years." He nodded again. He stayed for 2 hours, and we talked about other things, a trip to Montana we'd been discussing for a year, his granddaughter who'd just started college. When he left, the house felt less like a siege. The 30 days were long. There were good moments and bad ones. Kevin repaired a section of the gutter without being asked, which I noticed and acknowledged. Barbara cooked dinner one night, a pot roast, actually very good, and left a plate for me in the microwave. I thanked her. These were small gestures and they didn't change anything, but I logged them because I believe in being accurate about people, even people who have put themselves in your home without an invitation. Troy, for his part, was present but mostly silent. The confrontational energy of that first evening had deflated into something sullen and avoidant. He stopped making eye contact when we passed in the kitchen. He spent a lot of time in the garage, which I had made clear he needed to vacate and restore to its original condition before they left. On day 12, I went out to assess the damage myself. Francis came with me because my knee was still limiting my mobility, and I wanted someone there who would remember what they saw. We went through the side entrance. The drywall they'd put up on one side was amateur but structural, bolted into the studs, taped and mudded. It would need to come out. My workbench had been moved against the far wall and covered with a tarp. I pulled the tarp back and stood there for a moment. The table saw was still there. The lathe was still there. My father's hand plane, in its cloth roll, was on the second shelf, exactly where it had always been. Some smaller tools were out of their designated spots, and there was a layer of dust on surfaces that should have been kept clean, but nothing was broken or missing. I felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized was clenched. Francis said quietly, "It's all here." I said, "Yes." She said, "That's something at least." I said, "It is." On day 28, all 4 of them left. Kevin and Barbara loaded their belongings into the green truck and drove away without significant ceremony. Kevin shook my hand at the door. Barbara did not, but she looked at me for a moment in a way that might have been an apology, or might have been something else entirely. I gave her the benefit of the doubt. Melissa and Troy took longer. They had accumulated 3 years of belongings, and the process of packing was logistically complicated. I helped where I could, which was limited given my knee, but I carried a few boxes and held doors open. I was not cold to my daughter during that time. I want to be precise about this. I was not punishing her by being present and normal and loving. I was being present and normal and loving because she is my daughter and I love her, regardless of what had happened. When the last load was in Troy's truck and Melissa came back in to do a final check of the rooms, she stood in the doorway of the bedroom she'd used and looked around it and then looked at me. She said, "Dad, I'm really sorry." I said, "I know," she said. "Not just for the garage, for all of it, for 3 years." I looked at my daughter, 34 years old, her mother's eyes, and I said, "I know that too." We stood there for a moment. Then she said, "Are we okay?" I thought about this honestly before I answered. I said, "We will be. We're not there yet, but we will be." She hugged me. I hugged her back. Then she walked out to the truck and they drove away, and I stood on the front porch and watched until I couldn't see the truck anymore. Francis brought over a casserole that evening. Carl called. I sat in my workshop, which still had the drywall on one side but was otherwise mine again, and ran my hand along the surface of the workbench and did not say anything out loud, but thought several things. I thought about Patricia and what she would have said about all of this. She would have been furious in the early stages and clear-eyed at the end. She would have said, "Gerald, you let it go too far," and she would have been right, and then she would have sat beside me and been done with the recrimination. I thought about the 3 years of small surrenders, the truck in the garage, the coat closet, the cabinet doors opening and closing every morning without anyone asking what I might need from them. I thought about the way a house can become someone else's territory while you're still living in it, if you're not paying attention. If you're too focused on keeping the peace to notice that the peace is costing you something. I thought about what I'd told Carl, that I'd chosen myself, possibly for the first time in 3 years. I want to say something about that, because I think it might be the most useful part of this story. When Patricia died, I made a quiet decision, the kind you make without quite knowing you're making it, to need less, to be smaller, to take up less space emotionally, so that the people around me wouldn't have to work too hard to love me. I told myself that was generosity. What it actually was, I think, was fear. Fear of being too much, of being burdensome, of asking for things that people might not want to give. And that fear had expressed itself over 3 years as a man who did not object when his garage was used as a parking structure, who did not set a timeline when his daughter's temporary stay stretched past a year, then 2, then 3, who came home from surgery and stood in his own doorway and took one look at what had been done and thought, even for a moment, maybe I should wait and see how this develops. I was 63 years old, and I had paid off that house, and I had earned those tools, and I had nothing to prove to anyone. The moment I understood that, really understood it, all the way down, was the moment I stopped waiting and started acting. The drywall came down 3 weeks later. I hired 2 men from a local contractor, and they had it out in an afternoon. I spent the following Saturday afternoon reorganizing the workshop back to exactly the way I'd had it. Every tool in its designated place, the workbench at the right height, the lathe on the left side where it had always been. I put my father's hand plane back on the second shelf. Then I made myself a cup of coffee, carried it out to the workshop, and sat on the stool by the workbench in the quiet of a Saturday afternoon, and felt, for the first time, in a long time, like myself. Melissa and I talk once a week now. We are working through it, in the tentative way that people work through damage that accumulated slowly, carefully, with long pauses, with occasional moments that are actually good. She and Troy are renting an apartment in Dublin, a suburb north of Columbus. She told me 2 weeks ago that they are working with a financial counselor, which I took as a genuinely good sign. I have not yet changed the will back. I have not decided whether I will. That's a question I'm living with rather than answering prematurely. What I know is that Melissa and I are building something new between us, and whatever that looks like when it's finished will determine what I decide. I started a new project in the workshop last month, a blanket chest, white oak, hand-cut dovetails. I've wanted to build it for years and kept finding reasons to delay. I work on it for a few hours on weekend mornings, with the garage door open and the coffee getting cold on the workbench, and the neighborhood sounds coming in from outside, and my knee improving incrementally week by week. It's a good way to spend a morning. I recommend it. If you're living in a house that has slowly become less yours than it was, if you've been making yourself smaller for reasons that made sense at the time and no longer do I want to tell you this, the house doesn't become yours again by having the right conversation. It becomes yours again when you decide it is, and then act accordingly. The conversation is just what happens after the decision. I made the decision standing in my doorway, 38 hours out of surgery, leaning on a walker, holding my discharge papers. It was, in retrospect, the clearest I've felt in years.